Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's showtime.
Indeed it is. It's showtime. Here we go. We are, well, about less than 2 weeks to the most embarrassing day of the year. It's Boxing Day, right? And when you put all the garbage out at the curb after Christmas, oh my God, it's the most embarrassing day of the year at our house, because you realize all the stuff that you had under the tree and the kids tore through and everything else. So it's coming, folks. We're on our way to making the turn for Christmas. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Last week was the most wonderful time of the year. We talked about the Auditor General's report for the opposition and the press gallery. And I anticipate that there'll be a few more of those stories to come out of that tome over the holidays, because it will be a quiet time at the park. But it has not been a quiet week in and around Queen's Park. So, yes, we will get to Donald Trump and Doug Ford. The standoff continues there. And in fact, it was escalated this week, I think, for sure, all over the tariffs and the trade war that is pending. But I do want to get to the housing issue, because as we record, we're going to see the legislation today, I think, on the homeless encampments. The question around just the housing starts, the crisis there, the problems that we're facing. How are we going to actually get around all of this? It's great to have programs and plans, but unless we're putting shovels in the ground and building homes, it's not going to solve any kind of problems. And then I do want to get to Bonnie Crombie's plan for housing and the provincial land transfer tax exemption for new home buyers and seniors. Does it help? Does it work? Is it a flash in the pan? Well, let's get around to it. We've got the crew around the table here on the ledge. John Wright is here with us this morning. He is the veteran pollster and co-founder of On the Ledge. Keith Leslie joining us from his cave in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, and of course a longtime observer at Queen's Park. And you hear and see him on CHTV in Hamilton. Kathleen Wynne, former Premier of Ontario, might have a thing or two to say about what Bonnie Crombie's up to. And, well, we just lost Tim Hudak, but we know he's around. So we'll wait till Tim Hudak pops back into studio here. He's having internet issues. We had that problem last week with Anne-Marie Aikens. We were doing the show Now and Next, and Anne-Marie was trying to talk to us from the Via train. We got her on, but it was in and out. So we'll make sure we pop Tim into the studio as soon as he's back in here with us. Kathleen, I don't know if you had a chance to read Ed Keenan's piece in the Star this week, and I thought it was really important. And you know, the headline is a good one insofar as he's telling us there are solutions. There's a simpler, cheaper way to solve homelessness in Toronto, but there's one catch. And he goes on to detail all of the really robust programs and the ideas and the initiatives and the commitments that governments have had over the years. The bottom line is, we got to build housing if we're going to solve housing, and we're just not doing it.
So I appreciated Ed's article, and I think that the takeaway from it for me was, as others have said, we actually know what to do. We know what to do. It's not a mystery. But it's getting all of the ducks in a row. And I think that there's another catch, which is that we need to be better about building a continuum of housing. There isn't one solution. It's not just that the government has to build more housing. It's not just that we need to get developers on side. It's not just that we have to have inclusionary zoning. There's a whole range of things that we have to do. And I have been talking with folks about plugging those gaps. So there is a good program in Toronto where, and I've heard city councillors talk about it, people like Shelley Carroll, where people are moved out of encampments into homes, and there is support. So that housing first policy is in place. It's just not robust enough. There aren't enough. It doesn't move fast enough. And there are other solutions like tiny homes, for example. There are examples in Waterloo where there have been communities of these tiny homes built. They're not the ultimate solution. They are a transitional option, and they, I think, things like that can fill a gap and get people out of a tent in a campsite or tent in a park and get them into a building. But the final thing I would say is that none of this works unless there are the other supports in place. So whether it's addiction treatment, whether it's mental health supports, those are the kinds of things that allow people to stay in a home once they're there, because otherwise the cycle continues and people end up on the street again or in a camp. So we know what to do. It's a matter of the political will to do it.
Yeah, John, it's kind of like the conversation we had a week or so ago about congestion. There's no one solution, and you can't not ignore them all in order to have a final solution. You've got to really look at it and say, this is the cycle of homelessness. This is the cycle of affordable housing.
Yeah, I guess you divide it into different groups of people who are affected by this. There are home-starved people, so there are people who don't have any mental or health issues, but have, for whatever reason, they can't afford to go into a house and they have been displaced. They may even be refugees who have come to this country and they have no place to go, and they're trying their best to move forward. There are those who are genuinely homeless because they have certain conditions that have to be remedied as well. And then there are people who may be in a temporary situation, which, going from place to place, just don't have a place to live. And, I saw City Council this week in Toronto saying that they were going to expand the shelter system. I think within the next few years, they're trying to get 1,200 spaces that are going to be open. But I reflected on this the other day. I had to go down to a camera shop down at Queen and Church in Toronto. And so I parked across from St. Michael's Hospital and I walked down to just past Church Street. And the amount of people who, are doing open needle injections, who are sleeping on the streets. It was remarkable. And I'm not casting aspersions on them. Addictions can be caused, as we talked about recently, opioids that you are prescribed and you take for 5 weeks and you're hooked, and it can ruin the rest of your life. But I think what the Premier just said is really important. You have to look at this as a continuum, but you also have to have those services in place. It's not just about having a roof over your head. You've got to make sure that there are other places there. And I don't know how you solve the issue of addicted homeless people. But boy, oh boy, I could sure see it walking that stretch of about 2 to 3 blocks. It is remarkable. And even if you supply a home or a house or some temporary shelter, that's not going to solve the issue for them.
Yeah, and Tim Hudak's back with us. I don't know how much you caught of that conversation, but we were talking about Ed Keenan's piece in the Star this week, just to sort of launch the discussion, Tim. It's not that we don't know what to do about homelessness. It's just that we're not. It's not even about homelessness. It's about housing. And I say, I don't, not to diminish homelessness, but the idea that we know what to do to deal with the housing crisis. We're just not building enough houses.
Very, very true. Well, look, I think we can all agree that the current plan is not working. In fact, it's becoming worse with more and more encampments, more addiction, more deaths as a result, and higher crime. So something clearly needs to be done. And the legislation that Premier Ford brought in this past week is helpful in addressing the abilities for mayors and chiefs to clear encampments. We saw recently in Hamilton that they're digging tunnels, right, for power lines and such. To your point, Dave, we've had a failure on the housing file. There were a number of very good ideas put on the table by the Housing Affordability Task Force. I had the honor of serving on that task force. And while we had some initial momentum and some legislation brought through, it really feels like we've fallen off the tracks in getting that done. Number one, municipalities are not using the tools that they've been given. So the province, I think, needs to force tools or incent them to a greater extent. But when it comes to the housing spectrum, we saw municipalities back away from actually, building more shelters or converting places to residences to get through this crisis. We allow NIMBY forces to be too strong and overwhelming to actually helping solve problems when it comes to housing across the spectrum. And development charges are back up again. We've really taken our foot off the gas when it comes to housing, and we're paying the price across the spectrum.
Keith, the question around this sort of holistic view is not new. I mean, in terms of, we have to look at all of the elements that contribute to the housing crisis, whether it's from the encampments or from young families who are unable to get into the housing market. And I've asked this question about other issues like poverty in the past. Is it just too big to get our arms around?
No, it's not too big to get our arms around. There's always going to be a homeless problem to some degree, especially amongst people who are addicted to substances. But I think we can absolutely address this. The post-war, people have talked before about the post-war housing boom. The government's built housing to get everyone into them, especially young families. That's clearly what needs to be done now. And despite the obvious failures of the Ford government's housing policy, whenever that is suggested by the New Democrats, they're just called, that's communist, that's socialism, we don't believe in Marxist building houses and all. They just go right off and won't even consider it. Well, why not? Because as the focus of that article said, you can't have housing first if you don't first have housing. So if we don't build the housing, the private sector is obviously not doing it. They're literally sitting on the sidelines this year, a lot of the developers, because it's just not worth it economically. They can't get the prices they want, the land's doing all these deals. So we're building 80,000 homes this year instead of 150,000, which was the target. Way off. The whole policy is a failure. Yes, as Premier Wynne pointed out, there will have to be all the obvious supports once they get them in the house. But it's much easier to treat someone who has a roof over their head than it is someone who's in a camp, in a tent, in a park. And it's used, when I heard about the tunnels at Gage Park in Hamilton, I had these envisions of, the Gaza type tunnels. And thankfully there were just trenches where they buried their electrical cords. But nonetheless, they're literally getting entrenched into that position. And that's not what we can have. They need to be in a safe place. They need to have a roof over their head. It can be addressed. I say there's always going to be people that live in the ravines and under bridges because that's just where their mental health is at. And if we don't get more mental health supports, that's the concern. And that's a concern with the Ford government's legislation to clear the encampments is, where do we get them now for the treatment that they need? Everyone agrees that a lot of people need treatment, but if they don't need treatment, they need a house, and we can't get them a house right away. Where are we putting them? Army barracks? What is the plan?
Well, but there are answers, and you will all know that I'm involved with St. Clair Inn here in Toronto, and the story of St. Clair Inn is exactly what you're talking about, Keith, and that is this is a transitional housing opportunity for women who are homeless, who have had mental health challenges, and the objective is to have them transition to independent living in the community, and it is a success. They have 4 or 5 women in that house at a time with support, and it works, but it's intense and it takes time, and all of these initiatives are not overnight. So there has to be a longer term view to that. My concern here, Tim, is that we're looking for short term flash in the pan, quick headline bite answers to a problem that has been, and you've been on the front line of the housing story for so long. It has been brewing for years. It's not like we haven't seen it coming.
Right.
No, there have been really 20 plus years of under building. And, when you don't build the single family home, that means that, rentals get more crowded. And that means people in social housing don't have a place to move up. And then it trickles across the system, the spectrum. And as a result, those are in most of need of housing end up on streets. This is a symptom of a larger problem on housing supply across the board. The scaloric nature of a housing approval process, it takes forever, and the power of the small number of neighbors to block housing projects for families or for people who are just single mom who's currently homeless trying to find a place in a good neighborhood so our kids can go to a quality school. Look, but we are in a crisis. And that does mean that you have to have action promptly when it comes to enforcement, when it comes to temporary shelters. And then you can address the longer term issues like a better system when it comes to housing. And I also think, as we saw in British Columbia's debate, you're going to have the issue, Dave, about whether mandatory treatment is going to be necessary for some of these most extreme cases.
So
I guess what though, when as you talk about that, and I hate to harp on it just because I'm so immersed in this conversation right now at St. Clair Inn, is the woman whose story actually is the origin story of St. Clair Inn was a homeless woman who was living on a park bench in Don Mills, an affluent neighborhood in the city of Toronto. And it was in fact, you will know this well, Kathleen Wynne, because it was your riding.
Yeah.
And the locals, there were some vocal locals who said, we don't want a woman living on the park bench in our neighborhood. And so their answer was to remove the bloody bench.
Yeah.
And she ends up being found dead in a gas station washroom at Hogs Hollow sometime later. The local church stepped up and did three things. First, they put the bench back and acknowledged her life with a plaque on the bench. The second thing they did is they initiated an annual walk in her name to raise money. And the third thing they did was they went out and they bought the house that is St. Clair Inn. And, so there is an opportunity there where the community steps up and gets involved. So Kathleen, how do we leverage that momentum, that kind of engagement versus what Tim is talking about? And I'm not criticizing Tim for talking about it because I think it is an issue, the NIMBYism around it. And that's what killed Linda, in fact.
Yeah. But I've been to St. Clair and I've been on that walk a number of times. And, it's a beautiful example of how to do things, how to actually put the supports in place that people need. But look, it's a small place, Dave. It's something that the community supports, right? It's the kind of thing that sort of pushes back against NIMBYism or doesn't allow NIMBYism to grow up in the first place. So I think to Tim's point about the effect of and the influence of neighborhoods on getting things done, I think we can't ignore that. When I talked earlier about the need for a continuum of supports, including things I think like tiny homes, because a lot of people don't want to go into shelters. You talk to somebody in the tiny home movement and they will say the most important day for the people who move in is that they get a key. They get a key to their, 8x10 room that they can lock the door and it's private, safe space. So that kind of solution needs support from communities. And the biggest problem that the tiny homes movement has is finding land that will allow them to put up, 30 of these tiny houses without neighbors freaking out, basically, because it's different than building a shelter, but it's the same population. And so I don't disagree that there needs to be bold action. I would just say that saying that which is what this government is doing, giving municipalities the extra powers to move people out of parks, that's legislative energy and time that's being used to give municipalities the authority to do something that in the end is not going to solve anything. Because if there's nowhere for those people to go, what difference does it make whether the municipality has that power or not? And if we want people in jail, well, then we're really looking at spending money. That's the other thing that in that article I talk about, Malcolm Gladwell's article, $1 Million Murray, the most expensive thing that we can do with people who are living in parks is put them in hospital or put them in jail. And so I think that it's fine to take bold action, but if there's nothing at the end of that bold action that actually supports the people, then we're just punting the issue down the road. And I know we're going to talk about Trump and so on, but the simplistic bullying kind of answer to problems like this they're not real. They're illusory, and I believe they create more problems than they actually solve.
Yesterday, it was pretty quick in terms of the response. The headline popped in, and then Tim Hudak's email landed in my inbox. John, it was something though that you alluded to about 3 weeks ago when we were talking about Bonnie Crombie and how she was going to sort of assert herself and kind of cut through all the noise. And you were the first one that brought up things like capital gains taxes and so on. In this case, it was the land transfer tax vis-a-vis her housing plan. And I thought, okay, that's real money. Because both you and I have talked about this before. We're overhoused here in the city of Toronto. You're overhoused at your house. My wife and I are overhoused here. And one of the things that gets in the way of our conversation of downsizing in Toronto is the land transfer tax, the cost of that land transfer tax. And it's not just one. Here in Toronto, we have the benefit of having two because the city slaps one on it. So I thought it was one of those things that, well, okay, that's going to get a lot of people's attention. First, that land transfer tax for first-time buyers and seniors. And the point being, if the seniors don't have to pay it and it makes it more affordable to downsize, then it's going to free up your house, my house, and some young families can move into it and carry on with their lives. Just your thoughts in terms of how that plays out.
Well, I think it plays out well. It just has to be amplified because people don't really know what that plank looks like. But at least there are pieces now starting to form in the window that you can see the Liberals have contemplated, as a counterbalance to how the Ford government has portrayed them. I mean, the other thing that was, of course, noticeable this week was, despite the fact that 2 weeks ago, Bonnie Crombie seems to reject the carbon tax and say, I'm not with my cousin in Ottawa on any of this, the advertisements for the Conservatives bought well in advance still are pumping it out. So she's in favor of the carbon tax. Look, I think what has changed in the last month alone is that you're not having Bonnie Crombie, occasionally in the news. I thought this advertisement that is out there is giving more shape to a more personable individual, and there's some meat in some of the planks as opposed to just being complaints about, the developer friends that the government has. So I have to say, you're starting to see this plank emerge, and it can only bode better for them. I don't know where it puts the NDP on this front, though, because they don't seem to have much in the window to offer. But certainly for the Liberals, it must be encouraging for them.
Yeah, Keith, I've been the last little while thinking you got to stop hammering away at Doug's friends all the time, because we're tuning it out. So give me a reason to actually pay attention to you. I think this certainly starts a conversation. And I read some of the comments on the Star article I saw yesterday. And I don't know if it's good, bad, or otherwise, but somebody saying, $13,000 on a $1 million home is nothing. Well, it's $13,000. And quite frankly, it's $13,000 is the average in terms of the savings of that land transfer tax. So I imagine if you're spending or selling a $1 million+ home, then it's higher than that. But I think this is a good play for them, particularly against the backdrop of the $200 Dougie dollars.
This is putting something in the window that people can understand and get with right away. And I also think it's smart looking at not just first-time buyers, but seniors, as you said, to get some of you overhoused peoples out of those homes. But where are you going to go? That's the question, because an awful lot of seniors or people who have, the kids have gone, they're empty nesters. They've got too much house, but they don't want to go to a condo. They don't want to live in a box in the sky. Well, maybe it'd be time we could go buy a nice East York bungalow. Well, they're all just being leveled and built with monster homes over top of them. So where exactly, I think we need some regulations to protect smaller homes, smaller bungalows that are still existing in the city, so that seniors have some sort of option, and young families, young couples starting, have some sort of option besides everything over $1 million, which is just unsustainable. I think another part of the Liberal thing that is a really smart part of the policy as well, I don't know how it's going to play out actually, though, is getting rid of the development charges, which have skyrocketed in recent years and are adding, tens of thousands of dollars to the price of a new home. But how does getting rid of them make sure that that savings is passed along to the new home buyer? That's the concern about that one. But I think politically, this is a strong message for the Liberals, and it'll play. It'll absolutely play both sides of this. The development charges, people understand that now. They know what's going on, that the housing file has gone to crap, but they need something sustainable. And this just $13,000, that counts. I don't care what kind of money you're spending on your house, because most of it's going to be mortgaged anyway. $13,000 up front, a lot of money. People will get that right away. Everyone agrees, I think, on that one.
So Tim, given your background, you just off the top of your head, maybe I expect you have a sense of this, but what's the average price of a house in Ontario?
Went down under $1 million during the height of the pressure. It was about 1.2 million. And I'm not talking Toronto, Dave. I'm talking anywhere in the province of Ontario. I think now it's probably around high 8s to low 9s, which is really unimaginable, right? Like when I grew up in Niagara, I figured that I played by the rules and saved up a few bucks and got a good degree and a job, I can afford a home in a neighborhood at least that I grew up in. That was a dream of most Ontarians. And now for young people today, this generation screwed, right? That dream is out the window. Back to your point here, this is an A+. This is a bold move by Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals. I think it's a defining move the more people hear about it. It is very meaningful to help home ownership come closer to hand for average hardworking Canadians and get more homes built at the same time by getting rid of development charges. It can be up to $170,000 a pop before you put a spade in the soil to start digging. Here's why I'd add one more point to this, Dave. Right now, if you come from a wealthy background or your parents have a home with a tremendous amount of equity in it, you can help out your kid get into the housing market, right? And we've seen a significant increase in the boomers helping the millennials get in the market that way. But if you don't, you come from a family of renters, you don't have that kind of income, you don't have a hope in hell. And that's why something a land transfer tax relief is going to be helpful. That's money you have to have it on hand. You can't put that over the length of a mortgage. And that's really going to connect with the average hardworking Canadians and their mom and dad who love them dearly, but want them out of the basement into a place of their own.
Exactly. I kicked my kids out of the basement, and now I have a studio. So that's just worked really well. Kathleen, yes, the $13,000 is real money up front, but the $170,000 that Tim's talking about, now that's serious money. Now, but here's maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but if we don't have that money, at some point we need to invest in the infrastructure. We need to invest in the sewage pipes and the water mains and the sidewalks and all the road maintenance that's going to be in that new neighborhood if we're going to be building new housing. So, at some point we're going to have to pay for it anyway.
Yeah. So the municipalities will have something to say about that, right? Because that's money out of their coffers. But I think overall that it's really good to see this kind of substance coming from the team. I mean, obviously I'm biased. I'm glad that that's happening. But I also think that these are issues that are really on point for people who are paying attention to housing issues and people who are trying to buy, young families who are trying to buy. So I'm really pleased with this. The underpinnings of it, as you're suggesting, Dave, there are lots of questions about how does that hole get filled in terms of the infrastructure that needs to be built and the municipalities being kept whole. I think that's another question. And for sure, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario will be asking the Liberal team, asking Bonnie Crombie what that all means. But this is a substantial piece of policy that I think should signal to people in Ontario that Bonnie Crombie's team is going to have a lot to say about what the future of the province looks like, and as I would expect.
Well, speaking of having a lot to say about the future of the
quick point on that, do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a nice connection. Listening to the Premier Wynne speak there, when I left politics and went to become CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association, the Premier made me remember we actually worked on this issue when the housing affordability issue started to rise, and Premier Wynne, to her credit, increased the land transfer tax rebate to help people get in the housing market. So that was a nice way we worked together in those early days. The last point I want to make here, Dave, is let's not forget the Landlord Tenant Board as well. That's part of the Crombie pronouncements here to fix it. It is badly broken. It is not serving mom and pop landlords where this is their, savings and retirement, that they get some professional tenant staying and not paying the rent and damaging the place. It does not help that single mom who's got her kids and looking for a decent rental because it's blocked by somebody else. It takes forever to get these things through the system. You got to fix that. I'm hearing more and more from both renters and landlords how badly broken the Landlord Tenant Board is.
And she's also talking about phasing in rent control. I don't know what that exactly means, but we had rent control in place. It was lifted by the Ford government on buildings built after 2018. So, I think that some kind of recognition that rents are also unattainable for people I think that's an important part of the plan as well. But I don't know exactly what she means by phasing in.
Well, cost of rentals is one thing, but it's also a capacity issue, isn't it?
You mean the actual existence?
The availability.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And the degree to which we're actually building, rental purpose buildings is another issue. But yes, again, I think this is one of those things where it certainly has caught the attention, and I like the idea here, and I'm not cheering one way or the other, but I like the idea that we're having a substantive conversation about something other than Doug's friends filling their pockets, because I think that bell has been rung, and I'm not sure it's going to have all that much effect. Having said that, the Premier front and center this week again. Now, last week, you will remember, we were commenting on Premier Ford's appearance on Fox News to talk about tariffs, et cetera, and the Trump trade threats. And the anchor on Fox brought up the idea that, well, the president-elect had joked at Mar-a-Lago that Canada could just become the 51st state.
Well, the president has a good sense of humor, and, it's a funny comment. I guess he's still upset that, in 1812 we burnt down your White House, and he's holding a grudge after 212 years. But I understand he's a funny guy.
Yeah, he's a funny guy, except then Sunday, this past, he's on Meet the Press, and I don't know, it just didn't ring kind of like a joke.
We're subsidizing Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year. We're subsidizing Mexico for almost $300 billion. We shouldn't be subsidizing. Why are we subsidizing these countries? If we're going to subsidize them, let them become a state. We're subsidizing Mexico, and we're subsidizing Canada, and we're subsidizing many countries all over the world. And all I want to do is I want to have a level, fast, but fair playing field.
Level, fast, but fair playing field. The Premier was hosting a call with the First Ministers this week, and at Queen's Park, he updated the media on the tenor and the tone of that call, and basically said, we're rolling up our sleeves.
We need to be ready. We need to be ready to fight. This fight is coming 100% on January the 20th or January 21st. We don't know what extent this fight's going to go to, but we need to line up everything that we're going to tariff and make sure that the tariff, the money that's coming from these tariffs, don't go into a federal bank account sitting there somewhere. It needs to be immediately distributed right across the province equally, and we'll be able to support the companies, the factories, the workers for any issues that they're facing at the time.
So he's looking, of course, on this side of the border, making sure that the Canadian businesses, et cetera, are taken care of. But was asked, if we retaliate and we've got our list ready to go, what does that mean?
We will go to the full extent, depending on how far this goes. We will go to the extent of cutting off their energy, going down to Michigan, going down to New York State, and over to Wisconsin. I don't want this to happen, but my number one job is to protect Ontario, Ontarians and Canadians as a whole, since we're the largest province.
So much for the, that was a funny line last week. This week, we're ready to cut off their energy, Keith, and leave them in the dark and freeze.
Well, it certainly takes a tariff war that he says is absolutely coming and escalates it by saying we're going to cut off your energy, not put a tariff on it. We're going to cut off the electricity we send to those three states. That's a pretty dramatic increase. And I think the province, we saw Doug Ford here, he was chair of the Council of the Federation of the other premiers. So he spoke further than the federal government was willing to speak on this. They kept talking about mines and minerals and this sort of stuff. They didn't want to talk specifically like he was about cutting off energy supplies to the United States. Very interesting threat from Ford. The arrogance, I know we know Donald Trump, his whole art of the deal and that massive ego of his, but the arrogance, the way he just said, first of all, misinterpreting the $100 billion in trade as supplementing us. And then he comes back with, let them become a state. Because that's our aspirations as Canadians, is to become the 51st state. Just the arrogance in that alone makes it a very difficult man to deal with going forward. So I think Premier Ford is doing exactly what most Canadians would say. He's taking that populist stance again. Well, screw them, we'll cut off their energy. It's not just we'll pick the strategic, in the last time in Trump's first administration, we picked Kentucky bourbon because Mitch McConnell represented Kentucky, things like that, strategic tariff retaliation. This time looks like we're going to take it right off the bat. He wants to play hardball. Doug Ford apparently wants to play hardball too, despite the fact he was willing to take a joke the first time. But as you said, Dave, the way Trump's appearance on that, it didn't sound like a joke anymore. Let them become the 51st state. It's almost impossible to respond to that kind of thing other than say, that is not our desire, sir.
Well, John, back to your LinkedIn post there a few weeks ago, that this is kind of getting at that. Your note was that this isn't necessarily about the trade specific, the issues around it. It's using language around trade to incite, this kind of reaction first, but it's quickly and dangerously can get off the rails.
Yeah, it can. I want to make some metaphors in a way here. I think it's like playing three-dimensional hockey. You got to play the puck and not the man, right? Like, we're not attacking him. The premier wasn't attacking him on, whether we want to be the 51st state. We have to take the policy initiatives here to make sure that we're in the right frame to respond effectively. The three dimensions, though, I mean, look at on one hand, the federal government hosted, the Freeland and LeBlanc hosted the meeting with the premiers. And I mean, they had to deal with the prime minister's comments on Kamala Harris and the election of the fallout there. I don't know, other than the fact that he just thinks everything is a domestic message. He shouldn't have done that. But having said that, you've got, the federal government is kind of the good cop in all of this. And then you've got now Captain Canada, who's leading the premiers, and we'll see what comes out of the meeting this coming Monday on it. But he's putting some real teeth into this. Danielle Smith will probably have a very different approach to it because it's the energy patch there, and you're not going to have her, saying, well, we're not going to send oil south of the border. But I also framed this, though, on that third dimension, that we're headed into an election, possibly an election window. And this is something that the premier, in fact, is also going to say, I want to mandate for. I want to make sure that we are strong at the table. I think this is a key part of the plank that he could have. But it just shows that this is a very complicated file. But the last thing you want to do, and this is where the prime minister got off the rails on this, is criticize an election campaign or criticize the man himself. Play the puck and get ready, because it's going to be elbows up all the way.
Yeah, I just thought the comment around how he is at his core a feminist was, what are we talking about here? But again, complete distraction. Tim, I know you and I disagreed yesterday when we were on the roundtable on John Moore's show, just about the elbows up and the sort of how we should be going into this, and that was based on Alan Rock's comments in terms of we should be tougher and take to not stand up to the bully, was more or less what he was talking about. Now we hear from the premier, good, bad, or otherwise.
It strikes me that we had a good strategy and then we've quickly moved off strategy, and I think that's long-term danger. So let me explain by what I mean by that. First, I get it for domestic audience, right? Standing up to the American bully and standing up to Trump and all of that. I'll look forward to talking to more people about it, but I suspect that has appeal. But that's short term, and I think it's fleeting and doesn't help advance the ball in the States by fanning the flames and getting involved in any kind of Twitter war with President Trump. I think we should bring to the table our plan to address the issues that President Trump's brought forward, but a lot of Canadians share, making our border stronger in both directions, fixing a broken immigration system, and doing more to support our defense. And then engaging with other decision makers, governors, senators, et cetera, to say, look, if we get into a tariff war, here are the consequences that doesn't help out your constituents. The calms or rational long-term plan approach at the end of the day. Look, I think you take President Trump seriously, but you don't take him literally. A 25% tariff increase would prove disastrous for their supply chain and increase their costs of energy substantially. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do worry about throwing more gas to the flame, even if it appeals to Canadian voters in the short term. That doesn't help us get to the finish line.
Yeah, Kathleen, I said yesterday, I'm not sure that Donald Trump is a serious man, but we need to take him seriously in this respect. So, and I can see where I'm not sure that we want to. Mom used to say, sometimes the best way to deal with the bully is just to give him a good punch in the mouth. So, I mean, swing from the floor was always her advice, and get it over with in a hurry. But I can see how that there would be a constituency in the United States hearing the premier speak like that. It's not just Trump saying, fuck you. You think you're going to push us around? You're in the wrong game.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with Tim on this, that there has to be a rational plan. But I also think, to John's point about the good cop, I think there is always at play in these, and there certainly was when I was premier in 2016 and we were putting together our list of retaliatory measures. There was an element of the prime minister having the opportunity to play the good cop and to say to the powers that be in the States, there are things that the provinces have control over, and I'm not going to be able to control these these wild premiers. I mean, there is an element of playing on two fronts here. And I think that whether Ford had a conversation with the Prime Minister's office before he said what he said, probably not. Who knows? I have no idea. But there is light between what Ford is saying and what the Prime Minister is saying, and that's okay. I really think that's okay in this kind of negotiation, because the Prime Minister he's got a different role in this. The provinces have some very specific things that they are going to bring to the table. I personally think that threatening to shut down power to the Eastern Seaboard is a crazy kind of thing to say. I don't think it's helpful, but there's an element of people want to hear that we've got strength and that we're going to try to out-bully Trump, which I don't think is possible. But I guess there's a constituency for that, and certainly Ford is built for that. Doug Ford is built for bullying somebody, and so this is kind of a game that he I understand would want to play. I just hope that, that the broader strategy at the federal level is to do exactly what Tim is saying, to bring forward the consequences of a 25% tariff, have that real conversation that corporations in the United States and governors and representatives in Congress are going to all have opinions about, that what we bring forward dovetails with the best interests of Americans as well. If I can just make one comment about the remarks that the Prime Minister made at the Equal Voice event around the misogyny in the election. Whatever, maybe it was ill-advised, but I just want to say that there is no denying that there's systemic misogyny in our society and in the American society. And if you guys want to argue with me about that, I'm happy to have that discussion. But that's probably what the Prime Minister was getting at, that we are, that we're stepping back. Whether that's why Kamala Harris lost or not, I don't know. There certainly were people saying, I'm not voting for her because she's a woman, and there were 9 million votes that kind of went missing. So who knows? But don't tell me that there's not a new permission for misogyny that started in 2016, maybe with Trump, or maybe it's just part of the backlash that we're experiencing in terms of progress that's been made on social issues for the last 50 years. I don't know, but systemic misogyny exists. And whether the Prime Minister said it in the words that were palatable to the men, who are listening, the fact is it exists. And, we haven't come as far as we should have in I'm 71, so in the 60 years that I've been fighting this battle. So
let me suggest though that for a second, last week we commended Justin Trudeau for being prime ministerial in terms of his posture and how he managed the going down to Mar-a-Lago and how he dealt with the opposition leaders. I don't think that scolding the Americans for not electing a woman, and that's how it came out, was necessarily prime ministerial.
Well, that's how you heard it, Dave. Now maybe that's how everybody heard it, but it's not how I heard it. He was at a group. He was talking to a group of women who have been working for years on getting more women into politics. That's who he was talking to. He was talking to Equal Voice, and he was saying that's what happened in the States, and he was bemoaning that that's what happened because systemic misogyny exists. But I don't know that you can draw a direct line between what happened in the States and misogyny. But the point that systemic sexism exists, I think, is a valid one. Maybe he didn't say it the way it should have been said, but I believe that's at the core of what he was saying.
Let me say I agree with you. I think his sentiments were right. As I said, I think it's meant for a domestic audience, and he was playing that card as he always has. So let's put that there. I think what it also emphasizes, though, the three-dimensionality of this whole trade issue, that you've got to be careful on how you're going to play the man as opposed to play the puck. And I think there's a couple of other things that we should consider in the next week or so. I mean, I don't know whether, Krista Freeland may be around in the next little while. She may be moved. Certainly, it's playing out in the press. Probably one argument that could be made is the only reason she remains as as deputy prime minister and finance minister is because she is a woman and because she has been put there by a feminist prime minister, that, as he would say. But nonetheless, you can see the pressure mounting in the public domain about removing her or getting her out of that position. And she's the one that the president-elect has said that he doesn't like her. So that's one more thing we may look at a shuffle possibly. The other thing was an interesting snippet that came out. And it was a snippet. It wasn't widely reported, but the Conservatives, with their team, had already gone down to Mar-a-Lago as well. So the federal Conservatives are now genuflecting and having some conversations with the incoming Trump administration. So this is a very complicated file. I will be fascinated to see how the federal Conservatives begin to roll out their response to this. I mean, the House is rising. They don't have much that they have to do. But the reality is now we've got them who have made an overture to the Trump administration, and they may have a very different conversation on this level.
Keith, I wonder what you're hearing vis-a-vis the lens from Atlantic Canada, Newfoundland, Labrador, because, you know, early on when we had this conversation, it was that more or less to Kathleen's point around the interests of each province or region, and the premiers are going to have their say. You know, we heard some strong language coming out of Atlantic Canada and Newfoundland, Labrador early on. Are you getting a sense of how this is playing?
Oh, sure. And they're talking some strong language. The New Brunswick premier was on last night, right after Premier Ford. And she talked about cutting off 320,000 barrels a day going to New England states from the St. John's refinery. So they're willing to play hardball. Absolutely. Is this the right move? The two elected politicians here have the experience to say it's a dangerous track to go off on so quickly, so soon. To have that ready in our backyard or you know, in our back pocket to pull out that kind of thing. But this whole energy thing seems a bit over the top. But as I say, the New Brunswick premier, she's, you know, on the job a week or two, and boom, yeah, she's willing to go that far, that fast. So the premiers must have had a really interesting conversation yesterday with the prime minister on the phone, and perhaps to the point that's been raised already, we're going to let the provinces talk tough, and the federal government will just, you know, sort of sit a little bit back and try, you know, we're trying to work with you here. We want to do this together, but it's going to hurt us both so badly that we need to do this. We need to stem this, come to some sort of agreement on what we're going to do with tariffs. Do we need them this high? And whatever we're going to do, we need to come to sort of a deal. Just a side note back to my favorite point of the Fox interview with Doug Ford was, what's a progressive conservative? I've never heard of that before. And him coming back with, well, I'm a fiscal conservative, which is, again, prompted a laugh line, but didn't, because he's the way he's spending. But the Fox people that are progressive and conservative, you can put that in the same sentence, just seemed too much for the Fox anchor to handle.
Yeah, indeed. Tim?
I'm just going to point out one irony here. It's a bit of a sidebar, but do we not all see some sad irony in Prime Minister Trudeau talking about how women have it tougher in politics, while simultaneously he and his team are undermining Chrystia Freeland as finance minister, like in a really ugly fashion? Jody Wilson-Raybould, Jane Philpott, right, he's not exactly been a champion in action of some of these women. And look, if you don't like your finance minister, then make a change. But undermining her character, and then, you know, running off to Mark Carney like he's some sort of Disney prince on a white horse coming into the rescue, I just find it a bit too much.
Yeah, I'll say that that's absolutely true, and I think the voters see it too. Look, the Abacus poll this week had the Liberals at 18% in the polls, and that, according to when you look at the polling, that's the bottom. Mm-hmm. It used to be 25%. We're now at 18%. So right now, this plane is flying into a mountain in the midst of fog. It's only going in one direction, and he's basically run out of time to try and even get another leader in place. So I agree with you. I'm sure that the audience sitting there listening to him probably had the same view.
Well, David Hurley will say that he doesn't know where the bottom is, John. So, and I just, to that point about a new leader, there's still time to have a new leader. I mean, just in terms of the mechanics. Keith, you'll remember we had a 3-month leadership race, and that was a delegated convention in Ontario. I know the country's different, but still, I do think, John, there's still time. Yeah.
But do you think? I want to ask you do you think he's going to go? I mean.
I am not weighing into that.
Okay. That's the bigger question, though.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's leave that there, and we'll come back next week. We'll wrap things up on the calendar year, and probably, I don't know. I keep saying we can look at bigger issues. I'm glad we got to some of the conversations, though, around housing that haven't really grabbed the headlines, so to speak. All due respect to Ed Keenan at the Star, good work there. But we need to be having these broader conversations. But who knows what's going to come out of Doug Ford and Donald Trump. So thanks to John Wright, Keith Leslie, Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, and they are, of course, our crew around the table on the Ledger Ontario Politics podcast. And the only thing I wonder, as we hear Premier Ford, being very forthright and strong on this file, if he's saying that in public, what's he saying behind closed doors? Anyway, be curious to hear what that kind of reporting might reveal. All right, that'll do it for us. It's on the Ledger Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.